10 terrifying accounts of encounters in the wilderness stories. Have you ever found yourself alone in the wilderness? Far from the hustle and bustle of modern life and feeling the sensation of being watched? Sometimes you just instinctively know you are not alone, that you are being watched by more than just shadows and unseen animals. From ghostly apparitions creeping through the woods at night to sightings of strange beasts and mythical creatures, here are 10 terrifying accounts shared by hikers, campers, and hunters of paranormal encounters in the wilderness. A perfect circle. My pops and I are avid campers, not professionals anymore, but my dad used to be a wilderness guide for kids. We typically prefer the eastern and western Sierras as they have great car camping spots next to lakes and a lot of great trails. Last summer, we decided to go for a 2-night stay and do some day hiking. The campground was pretty full, not unusual for the summer, but we were lucky enough, I thought at the time, to find a pretty secluded site, and we set up our tents. First night was normal. Little bear activity, but we're used to that. Second night, I crawl into my backpacking tent, head and toes hit both ends very small, and I pass out cold. Until about 3 a.m. when I wake up to the sound of footsteps. My dad is a diabetic and needs to get up to pee around 3 to 4 times a night. And the sounds are definitely footprints, but they're coming from the wrong direction. We were located next to the bathrooms, so the footsteps should be moving in that direction, but they're coming closer to my tent. They stop about a yard short and the breathing gets really heavy. I first brush it off as my dad, maybe lost without a flashlight. The breathing goes away. I fall back asleep only to be woken a few minutes later to breathing right above the tent. You know that rush of terror up your spine? I have that. This wasn't my dad. I lay perfectly still, but the footprints continued to circle the tent. I had the rain fly on, so I couldn't see through the roof, and it was a new moon and pitch black. Now I convince myself, a heavy sleeper, that I'm dreaming. Just as that thought runs through my head, I feel a single finger run the length of my foot through the tent. Really slow and methodical. Now I figure, I have to be dreaming because my foot is in my sleeping bag and I couldn't possibly feel that, but that comfort disappeared quickly when I realized, using the small ambient light available, that my foot was bare and out of the bag. I lay frozen as, whatever it was, I shook my foot for a minute or two, gave a few more labored breaths, and then just stood above my tent for what felt like an eternity before disappearing. I stayed up all night. In the morning, I heard my dad get out of his tent. I bolted up and met him by the fire. He looked me in the eye and asked if I had gotten up the night before. I asked him the same question, and he said he had it around 2 a.m. because he thought someone was going through our stuff. As I told him my story, we noticed our gear had been neatly rearranged on the table. Every item, nothing was taken. Footprints in a perfect circle around my tent. We still can't even talk about it. The stick man. It takes 6 hours to walk through thick brush to the nearest passable road. Age 14, maybe 15, hiking and camping with 2 fellow Boy Scouts and an adult. We made camp for the night, had a cold dinner because it was too wet to scavenge firewood, and all turned in early. Even in the woods, there are noises. Frogs, owls, small game, and every sort of bug. My tent mate and I awoke at the same time, maybe 3 a.m., to hear nothing outside. Absolute ear-straining silence, like a woolen blanket wrapped around the head. After a few minutes, the bugs started chirping again, and we went back to sleep. When we woke up in the morning, we found that 5 of the pine trees surrounding our little clearing had been connected in a star shape with scraped lines, and pinned to each one was a stick man. Like the ones from the Blair Witch. The leader and his son, occupants of the other tent, accused us of fucking with them, but we both knew it wasn't us. That's a story nobody believes. I mean, who would believe the alibis of 2 kids? I'll never camp without the safety of a large group and nearby civilization ever again. The land remembers. One night, I was camping near where an old river dam had been. I pulled the canoe in late, so I just draped the tarp over the canoe and crawled in underneath it and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of roaring water. I crawled out from under the tarp and the sound stopped. I thought I must have been imagining it, or it was the wind through the trees or something. I crawled back under the tarp and the sound started again. This time when I crawled out, it didn't stop. The sound got louder and louder. I realized that it sounded like water ripping through the woods. Even the dogs had their hair on end. I quickly pulled the tarp off the canoe and dragged it up to the top of a ridge and waited to see what was making that noise. Then I heard the voices, men yelling and a dull thumping noise. I huddled down next to the boat, pulled the dogs close and waited for the sun to come up to find out what was happening. Morning came and there was nothing to see. To this day, I don't know what that was, but I have my ideas. I will not camp there ever again. I was told that the land remembers, and that's fine. I just don't need to be there when it's remembering. The skin changer. Wildland firefighter with the Forest Service. It's not my story, but from an old supervisor of mine that I believe completely. The year is 2004 or so, and the setting is the Hells Canyon area of central Idaho. Crew had been working all day on an emerging incident and were going to be working through the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, second in charge, effectively, he was out ahead scouting on an ATV or some such. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time when a bobcat or lynx, it's been a few years since I heard that, appeared in the middle of the road, but didn't run away as they usually would. The thing stands there for a good 10 seconds, screams at him, scampers up a tree not 5 feet off the road. He finds this odd but not particularly unsettling. Just a half mile or so down the road, he finds a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land and no private structures should be there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight and someone had done a good job of doing so. The door had been punched out and secured to a hole drilled into the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything to get in or out. Peering through the hole in the door, he can see that everything in the house is upset. This has him kind of unsettled, so he hops on his ATV and heads back up the road. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Right where the bobcat had been, there stood a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet. Just standing there, he yells at her, asking if she needs help. She just screamed at him the same scream as the cat from before, and climbed right up a tree, faster than any human has a right to climb. Obviously, he nopes out of there as fast as he can. Unsure of who or what he just saw, he asks a local guy about the cabin. After asking around a little, a local Native American hears them talking and informs them that they saw a puma, excuse the likely butchered spelling, in effect, a skin changer, a warg. Now, I would not believe most of the people that tried to tell me that. But this was a serious man who did not mess around about many things. He was dead serious the 2 times I heard him say it, and I 100% believe he saw what he saw, laughter in the night. My dad and I would occasionally go hunting together when I was a kid. I was 14 and my dad knew a guy who owned what seemed to be half of Georgia. I mean, the amount of property this guy owned was ridiculous. He let people hunt out there, and if he trusted you, he'd let you camp out there for a couple of nights if you wanted. Before we did anything, he'd always make sure we had a way to call for help. I loved camping out there more than I did just going hunting for a few hours and coming home. I liked the woodsman feel of living out in the woods. We woke up early one morning and hiked into the woods. It was still dark when we got to our stand. We didn't see or hear anything, not even birds. I remember my dad commenting on it and looking back. It should have been a sign. Frustrated, we packed up and looked for a spot to camp, where we would set up again later that evening. My dad suggested we go deeper in to better our chances of seeing something, so that's what we did. We hiked for a few hours, found a clearing, set up a small camp, got settled in and passed the time by freaking ourselves out by talking about Bigfoot and other woodland creatures. We hike a short distance away from camp, set up our blind, and wait. Again, nothing. We get back and our tent has been pulled up and laid flat. Not in a neat way, but it's just kind of lying there. We thought it was just the wind or something, and we didn't put it up right and it collapsed. We didn't think much of it. Since we didn't see or even hear anything all day, we decided to leave the following day and try again later that week. We settle in for the night, build a really small fire, and just relax. Again, not even birds are making a sound. I remember thinking how odd it was to be this deep in the woods and only hear 1 or 2 birds the whole trip. Oh well, maybe we are making too much noise and scaring everything off. We went to sleep soon after settling in. It's pitch black in the middle of the night. I wake up for some reason just to try to go back to sleep. I'm in that half asleep, half awake phase when I hear laughter. I kind of jolted awake but didn't hear it anymore, so I figured it was a dream. I lay back down, and a few minutes later, I hear it again. It continues and gets pretty loud. I wake up again, but this time my dad is up too. He whispered and asked, "Did you hear that?" And this is when my heart dropped. He heard the laughter too. It wasn't a dream. We heard it again, but it was faint, and now that I'm actually awake, I'm paying attention to it. It sounded kind of like several people laughing in unison. It wasn't cackling or hysterical laughter, but just kind of normal laughter. It didn't last long, maybe 5 or 6 long seconds. I have never felt that much fear before in my entire life. We didn't hear it anymore after that, But needless to say, we didn't get any sleep. We packed up as soon as the sun came up and GTFO'd. My dad was convinced someone had followed us and was playing a prank on us. That's why we didn't see anything. He said while we were in the stand and blind, they were scaring all of the wildlife off with their unmasked scent and being on the ground. He says this, but he didn't go back out there for over a month. When he finally went back, he mentioned it to the guy who owned the property. He wouldn't let my dad hunt there anymore. Didn't say why either. My dad thinks he made the guy think that my dad was crazy or something. I guess it is possible for someone to have followed us out there. They must be legit ninjas though, because we went out before daybreak. Nobody but the owner was parked out there that morning. There were dead leaves and sticks everywhere, and they decided to laugh. It came from different spots, and I never heard a footstep. The fur coat. We have a family cabin in the middle of nowhere, on a small lake with 2 other cabins surrounded by forested areas and flatlands. About 2 miles away from the cabin, across the dirt road, is a wildlife reserve. As kids, we walked through there all the time. After about 30 minutes of walking straight into these woods, there used to be a collection of abandoned houses in an old settlement. We went exploring and found that the people who used to live there had just up and left. In each house, there were still dishes on the tables, clothing in the closets, cars parked in the clearings, and all the strappings for horses in the barns. In one house, the floor had caved in, and there were about 40 pairs of women's shoes scattered around the hole in the middle. No bones though, animal or human, nothing. After we saw that, we decided to stay away from the second floors of the houses. We figured they'd be structurally unsound. A skeletal treehouse in the middle of the clearing. After we told my parents, my dad wanted to come and look too. In one of the houses, we found a bedroom, fully intact. The sheets were still on the beds. The pillow still had the indentation of a head on it, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dirt, and the dust on the floors only had our footprints in it. At the foot of the bed was this stunning, enormous gray fur coat. There were a few moth holes chewed in it, and it was as dirty as everything else, but when we inspected it, we knew it was real fur, likely wolf or silver fox. It was gorgeous. My dad decided he was going to bring it back, clean it up, and see if he could have it remade from my mom. Dad was a thrifty guy. As we were leaving, I got a chill on the back of my neck, and about 60 yards from the house, I turned around and saw an old woman glaring at us from the window of the second floor. She had her hair in a loose bun and was wearing a blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream-colored blouse. I immediately felt super guilty. I grabbed my dad, who was about 10 yards ahead of me, and told him we had better put the coat back, because the woman was still living there and we had probably scared her and she looked pissed. We turned back around and I pointed to the window. I saw her glaring at us from there. No one there. I said she must have gone downstairs, and as we approached the house, still carrying the stupid coat, one of the windows in another house suddenly slammed shut. I fucking ran as fast as I could into the woods. Dad, being dad, stayed behind and started yelling for the lady to come out, saying he was sorry, etc. I went upstairs, no one there, dust on the floor undisturbed. Then he started up and dropped the coat in a big hurry, and we beat it back to the road as fast as we could. About 5 years later, the government demolished the whole thing. Shadows in the field. Camping in Wyoming, 2 hours from pretty much anywhere with my dad, my friend, and my dog. This dog was the calmest, albeit quite stupid, and nicest dog I've ever had. I've never heard her growl or bark at anything, no matter how much it presented a threat to us or her. She just assumed everything was her friend or food. It's late at night, my dad's asleep, and my friend and I are just hanging around the campfire. Out of nowhere, the dog bolts up, barks once, and starts growling in the direction of a field next to our site. Of course, we're freaking the fuck out, trying to figure out what the hell she's going on about, when we realize there's a group of shadows on the other side of the field. We just sit there, staring at whatever it is, when we hear a conversation. We have no clue what language it was in. This goes on for about 10 minutes of us staring wide-eyed at the shadows, didn't think to wake my dad, when the shadows just go away, and my dog stops growling, lays down, and falls back asleep. That was the one and only time she ever did anything like that in over a decade that we had her. It still freaks me out to this day. The blood-curdling scream. Some friends and I were doing some night fishing on the James River. We were sitting along the shoreline with a nice fire going, accompanied by the usual idle talk and a few beers, when suddenly everyone just stopped talking, like a switch was flipped off. We were all staring across the river and felt as if something or someone was staring back. It was a very uneasy feeling, which some of the group tried to shake off with their typical macho humor, when a blood-curdling sound erupted from the other shore that froze everyone in their tracks. This sound was unlike any other that I had heard, and it made every hair on my body vibrate and tingle. The only way I can describe it is that it sounded like a wild person with no language skills being gutted alive. No words, just this high-pitched, blood-curdling scream. Nobody moved or said a word. We were all staring at each other when, out of nowhere, a second scream, even louder than the first, erupted. By this time, several of us were sprinting to our trucks that were parked within 20 or 30 feet and retrieving various firearms. We all sat there quietly, with our eyes fixed on the opposite shore, watching the light from our fire reflect off the rocks. Hours later, we packed it up and left, feeling very unsettled. We never did figure that one out or even hazard a guess as to what was on the opposite bank, a gut feeling. Me and my eldest son took off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier Country. I have extensive backcountry exposure and even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp. On this day, we enjoyed the fishing and settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. The sky was clear and cool as the sun set over the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbows with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after pulling out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire, as it had been a busy day. I sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bounce off the little waves in the lake. There was still a light glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down, and I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake's waves gently lapping on the rocks. I awoke with a start. The fire was out and the lantern was out too. The moon was gone, and it was pitch black. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. I was paralyzed. I could hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bush. All was quiet. I had a horrible, uneasy feeling. I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive and I quickly threw on some wood. In the firelight, I could see that the boy had awoken and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring at me. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing, go climb in the tent." I lied. He crawled into the tent, but even in the light of the fire, I couldn't shake my wariness. Something was out there in the bush, and I could feel it was watching me. I gathered up my light and flashed around camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled into the tent with the boy. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tense. This time I couldn't shake the feeling at all. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and go get in the truck. I packed up all of our camp and drove around to the other side of the lake and slept with him in the truck. At dawn, I got up and looked across the lake where we had camped earlier, and another uneasy feeling came over me. I decided it was time to go home. I don't know what was out there, or what was going on over there, but I know my instincts, and something was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination. It creeps me out to this day thinking about that night, music in the night. My brothers and I were camping at this primitive campsite in West Texas. It was about 12:30 at night and we started hearing this very faint opera music in the forest around us. After heating up SpaghettiOs on our fire, we noped the fuck out of there and hiked like 6 miles by moonlight back to our truck and drove home. It was like it was following us, because we heard it all the way to about a mile away from the parking lot. The reason it was creepy was because when we got to our campsite, the park ranger told us we were lucky to be the only people for miles around because of how peaceful it was. He said there was no one else there.